70 years ago, Lionel Fanthorpe's first story, Worlds Without End, was first published. Not only has Lionel written hundreds of sci-fi stories, but together with his wife of 64 years, Patricia, has written books on an array of different subjects, including the paranormal, the unexplained mysteries of the world, poetry, and religion. I joined him in the garden of his home in the city of Cardiff. How and why did you start writing science fiction?
Well, it goes back a little bit earlier than that to when I was at school, and I detested lessons like algebra and Latin and things that I found difficult. So I used to go and hide in the school library. And the petition behind which I hid, there were books on that library shelf, some by H.G. Wells, some by Jules Verne, and some by other fantasy writers and science fiction writers. And while I was avoiding the algebra and Latin that I didn't want, I would read H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, Journey to the Centre of the Earth and Round the World in 80 Days, so that my real interest in science fiction began with those classical writers. And then, by the time I was, let's just see, was in 52 when I was 17, I was reading science fiction again, and I thought, I could do something like this. I like these ideas. So as a basic answer, I'd say by reading the science fiction that others had written, it sort of stimulated the ideas. And my other great interests at that time were in theology and philosophy and in what the world was all about. Why are we here? What is the universe? And if we think about this latest news item of those magnificent pictures they've taken on this superb camera that goes right across the galaxy and beyond, way beyond the galaxy, I was trying to solve the problem deep in my subconscious of what is this universe we live in? What are we here for? And how can we make the best of it? And that's where it all began.
Your first published story was Worlds Without End. Where did the initial idea come from?
Well, continuing from what I said about philosophy and theology that interested me very much, I started off with the idea, and I was trying to think my way through whether the universe was a creation of God or whether it was just something that had occurred naturally. And I had a hero who was going through the problems that I was going through at that almost subconscious level as to, is there a God? If so, is this his creation? If there isn't a God, is it just something natural that sprang into existence on its own? So I had the captain of the ship, who was a devout believer, being sent out to see whether the universe had an end, whether he would fly into the end, the edge, the boundary of the universe, and of course be killed in the process, or whether there was no limit. And in both cases, he was on a loser. If there was a limit and he hit it, he's dead. If there is no limit, then his religious faith is wasted because there was no God to have created it. There's no limit. It's just a natural phenomenon. And the main part of the story, these thoughts going through his mind, what's going to happen to me? Am I going to hit the edge or? And then a gigantic and very benign and infinitely powerful hand comes out of nothingness, takes his ship, gently turns it round and says, I am here, I did make it, now go home and enjoy yourself. And that's the plot.
Who were your influences?
Well, I would think that when you're a teenager who cares about the world and about life, you talk it over with your teenage friends in school or down at the youth club, and by the time you've finished having a drink and having a dance and enjoying the music, you may have 5 minutes to talk about what is this universe we're in. And I would say it was the thoughts of other young men and women growing up and talking to each other and to me about who am I, what am I here for, what is this universe that we're in. And that was one of the major reasons for my thoughts about it. And then, because you couldn't, as a teenager with a very low salary, you couldn't go far or do anything in reality, we would go to places in our minds and say, well, let's just imagine what it's like on Mars or on Jupiter, or let's just imagine what it's like if we go beyond the other stars that we can see. What is in this universe with us? And those were the influences.
I understand you had a very unique way of working, which included bed covers and reel-to-reel tape recorder.
Yeah.
How did the process work?
Oh, when you ask a question, it takes my mind right back to it. And so I'd sort of come in from a day at work. I'm now sort of like 15, 16, 17. And I want to get to one of these science fiction worlds. I want to get into a paranormal environment. I want to shut out the real environment. And so what I would do to try and insulate myself from reality was to get under the bedclothes, pull them right over me so I'm sort of wrapped in them. We didn't have duvets in those days. So you just got under the blankets and you said to yourself, now, I am on Mars, or I'm on Jupiter, or I'm flying between the galaxies. And I then told the story as if I was the sort of equivalent in the 50s and 60s of a Greek storyteller entertaining the villagers as he goes from one to the other. And I just told the story to my very old-fashioned reel-to-reel tape recorder, which, just to digress from that for a moment, is now very proud to have been asked to lend some objects that relate to my writing career to the Metropolitan University here in Cardiff. And so there's an archive in the Met with my old tape recorder on it that I used back in the 60s and 70s, and in the 50s. Yeah. And I think it would still work. I don't know whether the tape I gave them has a story on it, but it may or may not. But it's all there if anybody wants to go and have a look at the archive.
And this activity was in Norfolk, I
Yep.
believe.
Yeah, I was born in Norfolk. My mother's family came from Barnard Castle up in Durham, and mother had got a job she was just a teenager, and had got a job in a local tobacconist's plus general items shop. And the proprietor, my dad, who was to be, had recently lost his wife after nearly 50 years of marriage. And he's got this attractive teenage girl who's just come to work for him and proposes to her. And within a matter of weeks of Mum getting the job as a teenager in Dad's shop, lo and behold, they are married, and the shop is in Norfolk, their house is in Norfolk, so I was born in Norfolk.
How many books did you complete each month?
Little difficult to answer with the accuracy the question deserves. The company who bought most of them were John Spencer and Company, who did Badger Books. And they produced 6 or 8 or 10 every month. And they would do westerns, hospital romances, and science fiction, ghost stories, horror stories, paranormal. And when they commissioned me as one of their writers, we would sometimes get a book done every week. So we were doing 4 a month, sometimes 5 a month. If they really got agitated, they'd say, can you possibly do this by Friday? And it's now Wednesday. So you sit up all night recording into the old-fashioned reel-to-reel recorder. and had a team of lovely helpers, Patricia being one of them, and my mother had been a shorthand and typing teacher, so she was a very good audio typist herself, and we had a group of other friends who were audio typists, and I'd rush a reel off to one of them and they'd get it. Now that also had an interesting effect in that it accounted for the galloping endings I sometimes got. Because when you're dictating, if the ideas are running and you're speaking fast, you're doing far more words than you think you're doing. And the publisher wanted 50,000 words in the book. Now, one of my typists, the one who'd had the most recent reel, would phone and say, Lionel, I'm up to 49,000. So I think, wow, I've only got 2,000 to do, and I've got so many characters still in dangerous situations. I've got so many unresolved mysteries. And this used to account for the galloping consumption ending. I'd have to try and finish off what I'd intended to be 40 or 50 pages, had to be squeezed down into about 3. So that if you look through any of those old manuscripts that I completed back in the 50s and 60s, it's not difficult to find the galloping consumption ending.
You wrote under a number of pen names. Why was this?
Well, the publisher wanted to use a number of short stories in the same collection, and he couldn't put by Lionel Fanthorpe, by Lionel Fanthorpe, by Lionel all the way through. So I had to find some pen names. And what I wanted to do was to be able to prove that the pen name was me. So I used extractive anagrams, and I came up with a list including Pel Torro, Othello Baron, Earl Barton and his brother Lee Barton, Thornton Bell, which was one I rather liked, and then Bron Fane and Oben Lerteth, who sounds as if he's a Martian, and then Trebor Thorpe, Neil Thanet and Olaf Trent. And they came up time and time again on the collections of short stories.
Who were your main competitors in the science fiction genre at the time?
Well, at the time when we were doing so many, there were some very famous names around there. There was Ray Bradbury. Remember, he's the guy who wrote Fahrenheit 451. There was Isaac Asimov, who always wrote about robots. There was Robert Heinlein, who did Starship Troopers. And, of course, Arthur C. Clarke with Childhood's End. Then on into the 60s, there was Frank Herbert, who did Dune, which is now flourishing again. There was Kurt Vonnegut, who did Slaughterhouse-Five. And, of course, one of the most talented of all time was Ursula K. Le Guin, who was famous for The Left Hand of Darkness. And unforgettable was Harry Harrison, who was the author of The Stainless Steel Rat and other rat stories.
You say that you did the majority of your writing during the evenings. So, what work were you doing during the day, and did it influence your creativity in any way?
Well, during the day, I started illegally, as I've done many things, as a dental technician. And I was doing an apprenticeship with this dentist, and way back before the First World War, anybody could be a dentist. You could just register as a dentist and set up a little surgery, and away you go, and heaven help your patients. And I was working for this old registered dentist and making false teeth. And it's so long ago that the false teeth were then made on a base of vulcanite instead of the modern plastic style. So there I was with a vulcanizer, and the guy I worked with was an ex-army dental technician and a very nice bloke, got on very well, and he was very helpful. But he always used to send me to the vulcanizer, which was the far end of the laboratory. And I said to him one day, Alan, why do you want me to turn off and then empty the vulcanizer? And he said, well, when I was in the dental corps serving in North Africa, one of those blew up. And if you could imagine, they're about the size of a big flower pot, just over 18 inches. And they're made of very thick steel shaft with a lid on the top, which probably about the size of a discus as used in sports. And he was, as I said, working in North Africa, and they had to use any fuel they could get hold of. And this vulcanizer got overheated and exploded. And this disc went up in the air over 100 feet, like a cannon firing a ball, except that it was a disc. And the dental surgeon, he said he always had enormous gratitude to the bloke, because instead of running for cover, he knew that Alan was in grave danger, and he rushed out from the dental service hut, flung his arms round Alan's shoulders and flung them both to the ground into the sand and said, "Just pray hard, boy." And he said the lid of this vulcanizer landed about 3 yards away from them. If it had hit either of them on the way down, you'd lose the top of your head. Very unlikely to make any more false teeth. But that was my first job with Alan Thacker. And the dentist we worked for was a guy called Charter Start. I got rather tired of this because I was on apprentice wages, which was very small. And I learned that friends who'd been at school with me were working in a factory for about £3 a week, where I was getting, in the equivalent of modern money, 50 pence a week. And I thought, no, I'm not doing any more of this. So I went to work in the factory, which I did for a few weeks. Then I heard another of my friends who'd been in class with me when we were at school had got a job on a farm where they were paying more, surprisingly, than you could get working in a factory. In the factory, which was called Metamex, we were making Metamec clocks. And I thought, I don't mind, I'll go and work on the farm. So I got the job on the farm. And then I found that was rather heavier work than I thought it was going to be. So I left, went back to my father's shop, and Father had a saloon upstairs where we had two ladies doing ladies' hairdressing, and we had one very old-fashioned short back and sides gents' hairdresser. So I got taught how to do army haircuts, short back and sides, with the electronic buzzers. And when I'd had enough of that, I was lucky enough to find an advert for an apprentice journalist in Fakenham, which was only 12 miles away. I got the job as a journalist, trainee, and then my good luck continued, because the man in charge of our Cromer office, which incorporated the town of Sheringham and Cromer on the North Norfolk coast, he got a better job on one of the big national papers, whereas ours was only a weekly, rural weekly. And they promoted me after just a few weeks as an apprentice to take charge of the Cromer office and the Sheringham office. And I felt very proud of myself, and I went off and took charge. And I was a journalist and greatly enjoying it, and carried on with the writing mainly.
Writing so many stories, I'm interested to learn where all your ideas come from.
Well, it's very difficult to know, I think, accurately at the deepest levels of our thoughts where our ideas do come from. It can be, using a simple example, if I'm looking at that rather unusual little tree over there, and I don't know if we can get a shot of that, the one with the little green sprouty bits right next to you, that came to us by mistake by a friend who'd gone out to buy a Christmas tree for us, and because his background was not British, he couldn't tell that from a proper fir tree. So he brought us that. And we said, that's very nice, thank you. Now, sitting here looking at it as we make the broadcast, I imagine a science fiction story in which you have a tree that is not a tree, but has a mind and has the ability to maneuver its branches. So it's like an orc in some of the famous tales where you have these living trees. And that could give me an idea, just sitting here doing our interview, looking across the other side of my garden and thinking, oh yes, suppose that tree contained a spirit, contained a mind. Suppose it was even extraterrestrial, that he'd come. I couldn't remember where he came from, but I came down one morning, there he was, sitting in a flower pot. And to my great surprise, he started talking to me. So that just is an example of one thing, just looking at a tree or a plant. The other things that I got very interested in was the kind of alternative events in history that if something hadn't happened or something had happened that didn't, how different would our history be together from what our real life is? And one or two I've done on those lines is that Julius Caesar was rather suspicious of Brutus and his other so-called friends. And so he tucks his short sword under his toga when he goes out to meet them. And as soon as he sees Brutus's dagger flash, his sword is out 3 times the length and strength of the dagger. And not only does the dagger go down, but Brutus's left arm goes down with it. And then Caesar cuts his throat as he falls. The other 3 run for their lives. Caesar remains the ruler of Rome for the next 50 years, which makes a very different history because the Roman Empire doesn't collapse. We are now under the reign of Queen Cleopatra the 25th, who is the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of the one who married Caesar. So you could take events which, had they been different, life would have been different. So you write about the difference that would have occurred if, as we use Julius Caesar as an example. And another one that I used was Joan of Arc. Had she not been killed as she was, what would the world have been like under her leadership? And various very able and important figures like her or Caesar, and imagine what the world. So there's another source of ideas going into history and saying, what if? And the other possibilities are that you ask yourself whether, had there been another race, if we take the Neanderthals and say, had the Neanderthals not died out, what would we be like today if we had direct Neanderthal ancestors? So I think if we tried to generalize that, we might say something like, the idea for science fiction and fantasy comes from asking the one basic question, what if? And then going on to develop it as if the if had happened.
Moving forward a bit now, perhaps you are best known as an investigator of world mysteries, the unexplained and the paranormal. Were you interested in these subjects when you were at the height of your sci-fi writing?
Oh yes, very much. In fact, it really goes back all the way to my school days when, as I was saying earlier, in the school library I was reading Tales of the Unexpected by H.G. Wells. And I was, from the age of 12 or 13, I was fascinated by the real meaning of the universe and what might have happened if this had or had not occurred. So I was interested in real life mysteries long before I ever put pen to paper or fingers to keys to write science fiction. That the real interest lay in, if this thing does not conform to normal life patterns, if going back to that little Christmas tree type over there, what if he really was an intelligent visitor from another planet? And I began wondering when I came across real life unsolved mysteries that that and the science fiction wove into each other. I think I could say that the existence of real life unsolved mysteries prompted the science fiction.
Lionel, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you on behalf of all of the viewers for entertaining us and your remarkable anecdotes. Now, come on, Vicar, let's go get another cup of tea and some cake.
A cup of tea and cake would be ideal.